For nearly 300 years, two superpowers had dominated the known world. In the west stood the Eastern Roman Empire, the surviving half of the once mighty Roman state that had ruled from Britain to Egypt. The Western Roman Empire had fallen decades earlier, torn apart by Germanic tribes and internal collapse. But the Eastern Empire, ruled from the magnificent city of Constantinople, remained strong. Its emperor, Justinian I, dreamed of restoring Roman glory, of reconquering the lost Western territories, of making the Mediterranean a Roman lake once more. Yet before he could look westward, Justinian faced a constant threat from the east. Across the frontier, beyond the desert borderlands, lay the Sasanian Persian Empire. This was no ordinary kingdom. The Sasanians were the heirs of ancient Persia, the successors to Cyrus the Great and Darius. They ruled from the Caucasus Mountains to the Indian Ocean, from Central Asia to the Arabian Desert. Their king, Kavad I, was a shrewd and ambitious ruler who had fought his way back to power after being overthrown and imprisoned earlier in his reign. The Persians saw themselves as equals to Rome, perhaps even superiors. For generations, these two giants had clashed over territory, trade routes, and pride. Every few decades, war would erupt along their shared border. Cities would be besieged, armies would march, blood would soak into the desert sand. Then, exhausted and drained of resources, both sides would agree to an uneasy peace. But the peace never lasted. In the year 526, war erupted once again. The spark was a distant kingdom called Iberia, located in what we now call Georgia, in the Caucasus region. Iberia sat between the two empires, and both Rome and Persia wanted to control it. When the Iberian king tried to switch his allegiance from Persia to Rome, Kavad I was furious. He sent his armies north to crush the rebellion and punish anyone who dared defy Persian authority. The Romans, bound by their new alliance, had no choice but to respond. Thus began the Iberian War, a grinding conflict that would drag on for years. At first, the war consisted of raids, skirmishes, and sieges. Neither side committed their full strength. Both empires had other problems to deal with. The Romans faced threats from barbarian tribes in Europe and needed to maintain their defenses along the Danube River. The Persians had enemies on their eastern frontier, nomadic tribes from Central Asia who constantly threatened their borders. But by 530, Kavad decided it was time to strike a decisive blow. He would not simply raid Roman territory. He would destroy the main Roman defensive position in the region. He would capture the fortress town of Dara. Dara was not an ancient city. It had been built just decades earlier by the Romans as a forward military base, positioned only a few miles from the Persian-held city of Nisibis. The location was strategic. From Dara, Roman forces could monitor Persian movements, launch raids into enemy territory, and provide a stronghold for any defensive campaign. Emperor Justinian had invested heavily in fortifying Dara. Its walls were thick and well built. Its garrison was supplied and ready. But walls alone cannot win wars. If the Persian army surrounded Dara and cut it off from reinforcements, the fortress would fall. The entire Roman defensive line would collapse. The road to Syria and even Constantinople itself would lie open. When Justinian received reports that a massive Persian army was marching toward Dara, he knew he had to act quickly. He needed a commander who could think fast, adapt to changing situations, and inspire troops to fight against overwhelming odds. He chose a young officer named Flavius Belisarius. At the time, Belisarius was in his mid-20s. He came from a modest background, possibly from Thrace or Illyria in the Balkans. Unlike many Roman generals who bought their positions or inherited them from noble families, Belisarius had risen through the ranks based on merit. He had served in Justinian's personal guard and had shown himself to be intelligent, brave, and resourceful. Justinian trusted him. More importantly, Justinian believed that Belisarius possessed the one quality that could not be taught: the ability to see what others could not see, to find advantages where none seemed to exist, to turn weakness into strength. Belisarius arrived at Dara in the spring of 530 with orders to hold the fortress at all costs. Accompanying him was another experienced officer named Hermogenes, a veteran diplomat and soldier who had served the empire for many years. Together, they assessed the situation. The news was not good. Roman scouts reported that the Persian army numbered at least 40,000 men. Belisarius commanded only 25,000. The Persians had superior cavalry, the finest heavy horsemen in the world. Their riders wore full armor, metal plates covering their bodies, and they carried powerful composite bows that could pierce shields and chainmail from a distance. These were not just soldiers, they were the elite of the Persian military, trained from childhood in the arts of war. Belisarius knew that if he stayed inside the walls of Dara, the Persians would simply surround the city and starve him out. A siege could last months, and reinforcements might never arrive. But if he marched out to meet the Persians in open battle, his smaller army would be crushed. Persian cavalry would sweep around his flanks, surround his infantry, and cut them to pieces. It seemed like an impossible situation. Retreat would mean abandoning Dara and losing the entire frontier. Fighting would mean certain defeat. Any ordinary general would have despaired. But Belisarius was not ordinary. He studied the terrain carefully. The ground in front of Dara was flat and open, perfect for cavalry maneuvers. This was exactly what the Persians wanted. But Belisarius noticed something. If he could change the terrain, if he could control how the enemy moved, he might be able to neutralize their numerical advantage. An idea began to form in his mind. It was risky, perhaps even mad, but it was the only chance he had. Belisarius ordered his men to dig trenches. These were not ordinary defensive ditches. Belisarius designed a complex system of trenches, arranged in a staggered, broken pattern in front of the Roman position. The trenches were deep enough to slow cavalry charges and wide enough to disrupt formations, but they were not continuous. Instead, they created channels, narrow passages where the Persians would be forced to funnel their attacks. This meant that even though the Persians had more soldiers, they could not bring all their strength to bear at once. They would have to attack in smaller groups through the gaps in the trenches, where the Romans could meet them on more equal terms. The Roman soldiers worked day and night, digging into the hard earth under the blazing sun. They did not fully understand what their young general was planning, but they trusted him. Belisarius supervised every detail. He walked the lines, inspected the trenches, and made adjustments. He knew that if his plan failed, if the trenches did not slow the Persian cavalry as he hoped, his entire army would be destroyed. But he also knew that this was the only way. Conventional tactics would not work. He had to innovate. He had to think differently. While the trenches were being dug, Belisarius organized his forces with equal precision. He placed his infantry in the center, protected by the main trench line. These were not the legendary Roman legions of old. By the 6th century, the Roman military had changed. Infantry still played a role, but cavalry had become more important. Belisarius's infantry consisted of light troops, archers, and spearmen. They were competent soldiers, but they were not expected to win the battle alone. Their job was to hold the center, to absorb the initial Persian attacks, and to provide a stable anchor for the rest of the army. On the flanks, Belisarius positioned his cavalry. This was where the battle would be won or lost. The Roman cavalry included units from across the empire. There were heavily armored cataphracts, similar to the Persian heavy cavalry, but not quite as well equipped. There were Hun mercenaries, fast-moving horsemen from the steppes north of the Black Sea, expert archers who could shoot from horseback with deadly accuracy. There were Heruli warriors, Germanic tribesmen who had entered Roman service. These were wild fighters, fierce and unpredictable, but loyal when treated with respect. Belisarius also had his own personal bodyguard, the Belisarius, elite soldiers who had sworn oaths of loyalty directly to him. These men were the best of the best, handpicked for their skill and courage. But Belisarius did not place all his cavalry on the front line. This was the key to his plan. He held back reserves, hidden behind the main position, waiting for the right moment. These reserve units would be his secret weapon, the force that would strike when the Persians least expected it. Everything depended on timing. Attack too early, and the reserves would be wasted. Attack too late, and the battle would already be lost. Belisarius would have to judge the perfect moment, reading the flow of combat, sensing when the enemy was fully committed and vulnerable. As the Roman preparations continued, the Persian army arrived. It was a sight to inspire both awe and terror. 40,000 warriors stretched across the plain, their banners fluttering in the wind, their armor glinting in the sunlight. At the head of the army rode the Persian commander, a general named Persian. He was a proud man, confident in his superior numbers and the legendary skill of his cavalry. When Persian saw the Roman army arrayed outside the walls of Dara, he was surprised. He had expected the Romans to hide behind their fortifications. Instead, they stood in the open, as if daring the Persians to attack. Persian studied the enemy lines and noticed the trenches. He was annoyed, but not worried. Trenches could slow a charge, but they could not stop it. His heavily armored horsemen would simply push through. Besides, he had twice as many soldiers as the Romans. Numbers would prevail. But before the battle began, something strange happened. On the evening before the fight, as both armies camped within sight of each other, a Persian champion rode forward. He was a massive warrior, clad in full armor, carrying a long spear. He shouted a challenge to the Roman lines. He mocked them, calling them cowards, daring any Roman to face him in single combat. This was an ancient tradition, a way to prove courage and boost morale before a major battle. The Romans watched in silence. No one moved. The Persian champion laughed and hurled more insults. He circled his horse in front of the Roman trenches, taunting them. Then a single Roman soldier stepped forward. His name was Andreas, and he was not a famous warrior or a noble officer. He was an ordinary soldier, but he had courage. Andreas walked calmly across the open ground, carrying a spear and a small shield. The Persian champion charged at him, confident of an easy victory. But Andreas was quick. He dodged the first attack and thrust his spear into a gap in the Persian's armor. The Persian fell from his horse, dead. The Roman army erupted in cheers. The Persians fell silent. It was a small moment, but it mattered. It showed that the Romans would not be intimidated. It gave Belisarius's men confidence. They began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they could win. The next morning, the battle began. Persian decided to test the Roman defenses before committing his full strength. He ordered his cavalry on the right wing to attack the Roman left. Thousands of Persian horsemen surged forward, the ground trembling beneath their hooves. They were magnificent warriors, the finest cavalry in the world. Their armor was thick and strong. Their weapons were sharp, their training was perfect. They came on like a wave of steel, expecting to sweep the Romans aside. But as they neared the Roman lines, the trenches did their work. Horses stumbled. Riders were forced to slow down or find gaps in the obstacles. The charge lost its momentum. The Persian cavalry bunched together, packed into narrow spaces, unable to use their superior numbers effectively. Roman archers on the walls of Dara and in the field loosed volley after volley of arrows. The sky darkened with shafts. Persians fell from their saddles, horses screamed and collapsed. The Persian cavalry pushed forward anyway, crashing into the Roman left wing. The fighting was brutal. Swords clashed against shields, spears pierced armor, men shouted and died. For a moment, it seemed the Persians might break through. They were stronger, better armored, more experienced. The Roman cavalry on the left began to give ground, falling back step by step. But they did not break. They retreated in order, maintaining their formation, fighting as they moved. This was exactly what Belisarius had planned. The Romans were not trying to win this phase of the battle. They were simply trying to survive it, to bleed the Persians, to make them pay for every inch of ground. As the Persian cavalry advanced, they exposed their flanks. Roman archers continued to rain arrows down on them from the walls and from protected positions behind the trenches. The Persians had expected to sweep the Romans aside quickly, but instead they found themselves stuck in a grinding melee, taking casualties, unable to deliver a knockout blow. After fierce fighting, the Persian commander on the right wing ordered a withdrawal. His men pulled back to their starting positions. The first attack had failed. Perozes was frustrated but not concerned. He had only sent in part of his army. The Romans had held, but they had not won. Tomorrow he will unleash his full strength and crush them. That night, Persian reinforcements arrived. 10,000 fresh cavalry rode into the Persian camp, including units of the Immortals, the elite guard of the Persian king. These were the best warriors in the Sasanian Empire, selected for their skill, loyalty, and courage. With these reinforcements, Perozes now commanded 50,000 men. The Romans still had only 25,000. The odds had gotten even worse. But Belisarius did not despair. He had survived the first day. His trenches had worked. His men had fought well. Now he prepared for the decisive battle. At dawn on the second day, the Persian army assembled for a massive assault. This time, Perozes would not hold back. He positioned the Immortals at the front of his left wing and prepared to strike both Roman flanks simultaneously. His plan was simple and brutal. He would send his best cavalry against the Roman right and left, overwhelming them with sheer power and numbers. Once the flanks collapsed, the Roman center would be surrounded and destroyed. It was a sound strategy, one that had worked many times before, but Perozes had underestimated his opponent. The battle opened with a skirmish between archers. Persian bowmen advanced and began shooting at the Roman lines, trying to suppress the Roman archers who had caused so much damage the day before. Roman archers shot back. Arrows filled the air. Men fell on both sides. The archery duel served a purpose. It provided cover for the main Persian cavalry assault. As the archers kept the Romans occupied, thousands of Persian horsemen began their charge. This time, the Persians attacked both flanks at once. On the Roman right, the elite Immortals thundered forward, their armor gleaming, their discipline perfect. On the Roman left, heavy Persian cavalry charged again, determined to succeed where they had failed the day before. The ground shook. The noise was deafening. The sight of so many enemy warriors bearing down on them must have been terrifying for the Roman soldiers. But Belisarius had prepared them for this moment. The Persian cavalry crashed into the Roman flanks with tremendous force. Despite the trenches, despite the arrows, the Persians were simply too strong and too numerous. The Roman cavalry on both wings began to buckle under the pressure. On the right, the Immortals carved through the Roman lines, killing and scattering defenders. On the left, Persian horsemen broke through the trenches and engaged the Roman cavalry in desperate close combat. For the Roman soldiers fighting on the flanks, it must have seemed like the end. They were overwhelmed. They were dying. The battle was slipping away. But Belisarius was watching everything from his command position. He could see the Persian cavalry fully committed to their attacks. He could see that they were focused entirely on destroying the Roman flanks, ignoring the center. They had pushed forward aggressively, driving deep into the Roman position. This was what he had been waiting for. The Persians had made a mistake. In their eagerness to crush the Romans, they had exposed themselves. Now was the time to strike. Belisarius gave the signal. From behind the Roman lines, hidden cavalry units suddenly emerged. Hun horsemen, who had been held in reserve, galloped forward and struck the exposed flanks of the Persian cavalry. The Persians had not expected this. They thought all the Roman cavalry was already engaged. The sudden attack from an unexpected direction threw them into confusion. The Persian advance on the Roman left slowed as riders turned to face this new threat. But Belisarius was not finished. He had positioned another group of reserves, a mix of Hun and Heruli cavalry, to the north of the battlefield, concealed from view. Now he unleashed them. These warriors swept down and smashed into the rear of the Persian right wing, the very units that had been attacking the Roman left. Caught between two Roman forces, front and rear, the Persian cavalry began to waver. The momentum of the battle had shifted in an instant. The Persians had been attacking. Now they were being attacked, but the fight was far from over. The Persians were elite warriors, trained to endure hardship and fight through adversity. They rallied and continued to press their assault on the Roman right, where the Immortals were still making progress. The Roman right wing was in serious danger of collapsing. If it broke, the entire Roman army would be surrounded. Belisarius made a decision that would define his legacy. He personally led his elite bodyguard cavalry, his Belisarius, into the battle. He rode to the aid of the struggling Roman right, leading a charge directly into the flank of the Persian Immortals. The timing was perfect. The Immortals were fully engaged, fighting the Roman cavalry to their front. They did not see Belisarius coming until it was too late. The Roman general and his elite warriors smashed into them from the side, cutting down Persians, disrupting their formation, sowing chaos. This was the turning point. The Persian right wing, already under pressure from multiple directions, began to crack. Soldiers started to pull back, looking for a way to escape. The withdrawal quickly turned into a retreat. The Persian horsemen, who had been so confident just moments before, now fled the battlefield, racing back toward their own lines. Their retreat left the Persian left wing, including the Immortals, isolated and exposed. Now it was the Persians who found themselves in a desperate situation. The elite Immortals, who had been pushing forward victoriously, suddenly realized they were surrounded. Roman cavalry swarmed around them from three sides. There was no support coming. The Persian infantry, which had remained far to the rear during the cavalry battle, was too slow to intervene. By the time foot soldiers could march forward to help, the cavalry battle would already be decided. Perozes had made a fatal error. He had relied entirely on his cavalry to win the battle quickly. He had not coordinated his infantry with his mounted troops. Now his best warriors were trapped. The Immortals fought bravely. They were the pride of the Persian Empire, and they would not surrender or flee without a fight. They formed a defensive circle, shields locked together, spears pointing outward. Roman cavalry charged them again and again. Men died on both sides. The Immortals killed many Romans, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and surrounded. Slowly, inevitably, they were cut down. Some managed to break through the Roman encirclement and escape. Most did not. The flower of the Persian cavalry lay dead or dying on the field. Perozes watched in horror as his army disintegrated. His right wing had fled. His elite Immortals were destroyed. His left wing was retreating in disorder. He still had his infantry, fresh and unused, but committing them now would be pointless. The Roman infantry had not yet engaged and could easily counter any Persian foot soldiers who advanced. More importantly, the morale of the Persian army was broken. When soldiers saw the Immortals, the supposedly invincible warriors, being slaughtered, they lost faith. Panic spread through the ranks. What had seemed like a certain Persian victory just an hour before had turned into a catastrophic defeat. Perozes ordered a general retreat. The Persian army withdrew from the battlefield, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded. The Romans did not pursue aggressively. Belisarius knew his men were exhausted. They had fought 2 days of brutal combat and were in no condition to chase a retreating army across open ground. Besides, he had achieved his objective. He had defended Dara. He had defeated a numerically superior enemy. He had won a victory that would be remembered for centuries. The Battle of Dara was over. Against all odds, 25,000 Romans had defeated 50,000 Persians. The casualties were severe on both sides, but the Persians had suffered far worse. Thousands of their best warriors lay dead. The immortals, the elite of the Persian military, had been decimated. The entire Persian strategy on the eastern frontier had been thrown into chaos. When news of the victory reached Constantinople, the city erupted in celebration. Emperor Justinian was overjoyed. For years, the Persians had seemed unstoppable on the eastern frontier. Now, a young general named Belisarius had proven that they could be beaten. Justinian rewarded Belisarius richly and began to plan even greater campaigns. If the Persians could be defeated in the east, perhaps the lost western territories could be reconquered as well. Perhaps the dream of restoring the Roman Empire was not impossible after all. But the victory at Dara had consequences beyond military strategy. It established Belisarius as one of the greatest generals of his age. It proved that intelligence and planning could overcome superior numbers. It showed that defensive tactics, properly employed, could defeat offensive power. It demonstrated that even in an era dominated by cavalry, infantry and field fortifications still had a vital role to play. Belisarius had not simply won a battle, he had revolutionized military thinking. The trenches at Dara were not a new invention. Armies had used field fortifications for thousands of years, but Belisarius used them in a new way. He did not dig a simple defensive line. He created a system of obstacles designed to control enemy movement, to channel attacks into kill zones, to neutralize numerical superiority. He combined static defenses with mobile reserves, allowing him to respond flexibly to changing battlefield conditions. He coordinated different types of troops, infantry and cavalry, heavy and light, in a unified plan. Every element of his army had a role to play. Nothing was wasted, nothing was left to chance. The people of Dara itself could hardly believe what had happened. They had watched from the city walls as the two armies clashed, expecting to see their protectors overwhelmed and destroyed. Instead, they witnessed one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history. The town that had been built as a fortress to slow Persian invasions had become the site of a triumph. For generations afterward, the people of Dara would remember the battle, telling stories of the young Roman general who saved them from certain conquest.